along several different lines of research, primarily in the realm of history, but with the understanding that history is of three different forms: sacred history, secular history, and mythology. And today I'm going to be primarily focusing on the mythological aspect of history. I'm going to start off with a understanding of what a myth is. When we speak of something being a myth, we do not mean something which is understood to be false. What we mean by myth is a understanding of an event which is understood to be historical, in which we participate outside of the normal temporal sequence. In other words, it is not to be confused with a fable. Thus, by way of a secular point of comparison, in matter of patriotism here in the United States, 4th of July or Thanksgiving are opportunities where the past becomes something which is present for those who revere those as national holidays. They are of mythological significance because we live now, but there's an aspect of us that is connected to the then in a way which transcends time. And it's not merely an empty historical event, it's something which has present-day significance to us and joins us to that other time. By way of contrast, a fable would be the infamous Washington cutting down the cherry tree. No one believes that to be true, and it wouldn't matter if it was, and it's not actually something which is of enduring significance by way of our participation. It might teach us something about the honesty, integrity of a man, but we know it's not true. The myth of the 4th of July is precisely mythological because we believe it to have actually happened. But it's something which has an ongoing, present significance in which we live right now. So if we're going to think about the mythic significance of Mars, it's important to begin with an elementary assertion, which is of fundamental importance. As interesting as Mars may be from a scientific perspective, the pursuit of scientific knowledge concerning the red planet is, arguably, of little enduring interest to human civilization in and of itself. Okay. In the midst of a meeting of the Mars Society coming from a member of the board of directors, that assertion may seem almost like some sort of heresy. I'm a Lutheran, I'm used to being accused of heresy. However, the assertion is fundamentally true. And the reality of such an assessment can be readily seen in the funding priorities of governments, industries, and nonprofit endeavors. Advocates of space exploration and colonization understandably are exasperated by the short-sightedness of such funding entities and ask the crucial question: why don't they understand how important Mars is to the future of the human race? But see, that's the whole point. As long as Mars is viewed as a celestial object of scientific curiosity, it will be perceived to be a ballyhooed recipient of government largesse simply on a grander scale than the federally funded research into the mating habits of snails. It's all well and good if it's of interest to you, but why are we supposed to pay for it? Well, obviously Mars matters, and thus, equally obviously, the scientific study of Mars matters. But the reason that Mars and the study of Mars matters is because the red planet has never been simply a matter of scientific curiosity. Mars has been of cosmic and mythological significance from time immemorial. Now, before we can evaluate such a claim, let's first attend to several points of definition. The English word cosmos is a cognate of the Greek word of cosmos as well, which means in its original usage both order and world. Thus, according to one of the standard Greek references, cosmos means literally something ordered, properly an ordered system, like the universe, creation, the world. Cosmos thus stood in opposition to chaos, from which once again the English cognate is derived, which was understood to be a state of disorder. In ancient mythology, chaos was at first a goddess, which was the gap between heaven and earth, which in time came to be understood as the mix of elements that existed in the primeval universe. a concept likely influenced by the Hebrew tohu wabohu, without form and void, of Genesis 1. This sense of cosmos, meaning something which has been ordered, carries through into received English usage. When cosmos is defined as an orderly, harmonious, systematic universe, and the adjective cosmic means, first, of or relating to the cosmos, the extraterrestrial vastness, or the universe in contrast to the earth alone, and simultaneously it means of or relating to or concerned with abstract, spiritual, or metaphysical ideas. These are inextricably bound up together in what cosmos, cosmic mean. Observing that Mars is thus a part of the cosmos is an acknowledgement that this world is part of an ordered system of the universe. And to acknowledge that this world may be part of cosmic significance carries a twofold sense right out of the gate. In that Mars is part of the cosmos which has been ordered, and that our discussion of that world, in this sense, is connected with abstract ideas. Now, in the dim origins of humanity's understanding of our place within the cosmos, Mars had a divine mythological significance. Mars, after all, was purported to be, among other things, the father of Romulus and Remus, a god of war which served in part as a justification for empire. The old calendar began with Martius, March, that is, the month of Mars. And martial Mars is hardly a European phenomenon. For the Hindu, for example, Mangala, Mars, was also the war god and the teacher at the same time of the occult sciences. In Babylon, Mars was Nergal, once again a god of war. Each such divine signification links Mars to a variety of cultic associations with invocation and participation in the worship of Mars as a deity, and a present participation in which that was mythologically associated with the god. The modern character of the myths about Mars has obviously substantially changed, but these modern myths have not ceased to be myths. As one scholar observed several decades ago regarding the character of myths, and I quote, "The myth claims a kind of relation to objective factual truth which other forms of elusive discourse do not claim. We become aware of this difference when we observe the tendency of the myth to be exclusive and definitive. The true myth is never consciously invented. It is a cultural inheritance. A new generation may reinterpret such myth. Indeed, often it must, but it cannot conceivably substitute another myth for it." End of quote. Today, the myths about Mars contend for a place among the visions for the future of the human race, and are of no less expansive sweep than the myths of old. Most of the modern Martian myths center on the red planet as a future home to human civilization. In fact, Mars is often seen as the sine qua non of such mythologies. It is presented as the first step in the future of the human race. And for adherents of these mythological constructs, although such individuals eagerly desire to see the day in which such dreams achieve a concrete reality, they are just as willing to act in such a way as to share in that future vicariously, and even by envisioning their own efforts, helping this future to come to pass. The curious character of myth is that it offers a present participation in an event which is, in terms of time, distinct from our own. Participation in rites related to myth purports to join its adherents to events outside their immediate temporal circumstances, and thus, traditionally, such mythic participation has been in past events. Thus, Mircea Eliade observes in his book entitled Myth and Reality as follows. "Myth," he writes, "assures man that what he is about to do has already been done. In other words, it helps him to overcome doubts as to the result of his undertaking. There is no reason to hesitate before setting out on a sea voyage because the mythical hero has already made it in fabulous time. All that is needed is to follow his example. Similarly, there is no reason to fear settling in an unknown wild territory because one knows what one has to do. One has merely to repeat the cosmogonic ritual, whereupon the unknown territory, chaos, is transformed into cosmos, becomes an imago mundi, and hence a ritually legitimized habitation. The existence of an exemplary model does not fetter creative innovation. The possibilities for applying the mythical model are endless. End of quote. Eliot's observations are quite apropos to our own considerations. The mythic journey inspires action. Now, however, the search for an assuring myth presses forward and backward in time. It is not at all uncommon and should be most welcome to seek various cultural analogies which can help us to understand what travel to and even settlement of Mars actually means. Thus, for example, in 1976, science writer Richard Lewis penned his volume entitled From Vinland to Mars, 1,000 Years of Exploration. Lewis formed a mythological narrative to unify the entirety of what he identified as a 1,000-year age. And 1,000 years is one of those, if you're at all interested in the study of myth, is one of those numbers that just carries all kinds of import and significance with it. And Lewis declares, quote, "The persistence of this feature of human behavior may carry future generations to the stars. We cannot see the end, but looking back only 1,000 years, we can examine the beginning." End quote. It is to this theme that Lewis breathlessly returns at his conclusion, ending his entire book with the words, "On September 3rd, 1976, Viking 2 landed on the rock-strewn plains of a subpolar region called Utopia, nearly halfway around Mars from Viking 1. As on the moon, reconnaissance would be followed by exploration, and exploration was man's role and man's fate." End quote. Now, fate is a word which is inextricably bound up with a supernatural predestination. You don't use that word outside of that significance. If you are, you're needing to consult your dictionary. No matter how secular one attempts to be in setting forth matters of mythological significance, the divine always reappears, even unintentionally. As a matter of fact, especially unintentionally. The most common arena for mythic participation in the settlement of the Red Planet is found in the realm of anticipation. In short, in science fiction. Myth expressed in and received from literature and film constitutes two of the most universal forms of participation, overcoming differences in present culture to establish a possible alternative culture. The common culture of the myth of Mars is seen as something of a significance which transcends the present time. As Buzz Aldrin wrote in his book entitled Mission to Mars, quote, "Humanity is destined to explore, settle, and expand outward into the universe." Destined. Again, a word of theological import. So that he then continues saying, "Younger readers have probably heard their parents or grandparents say, 'The world is yours.' I want to take it one step further and say, 'The worlds are yours.'" End quote. Again, destiny is inextricably bound up with a sense of supernatural significance, for it's impossible to avoid the invocation of the divine in matters of mythological significance. Other writers press out even farther, into vast eons beyond the settlement of the solar system. As Dr. Ben Bova wrote in his book, Faint Echoes, Distant Stars, which, by the way, features an image of Mars on its cover, quote, "Or will we," this is right at the conclusion of the book, "or will we in the fullness of time expand our habitat beyond the Earth, even beyond the solar system, and spread our seed through the stars themselves? This is the path to humankind's immortality. Once we begin to build self-sustaining habitations beyond the Earth, we will have detached the fate of humanity from the fate of the Earth. Once we learn how to reach other stars, we will have detached our fate from the inevitable doom of the sun. Is this the destiny of our kind?" End quote. Now, just in this little passage, any more expansive use of mythological motifs, and one is just shy of having to institute rite and ritual. Stories which anticipate exploration and colonization are not simply an account of what if. They are often critiqued precisely in terms of the degree to which they track to expectations of what will actually happen. And we don't like it if they don't conform to that which we believe will actually happen. Fundamentally, therefore, they are the absolute opposite of escapist literature. Rather, they are intended to be almost invocatory in nature. Myth is an element of culture, and the adherents of the myths of Mars, the culture which is to come, already exists in a primordial form. The myths of Mars are gaining strength in proportion to Mars becoming a human place in the minds of human beings. Thus, Eliot observes, again, to quote, "Myth narrates a sacred history. It relates an event that took place in primordial time, the fabled time of beginnings. In other words, myths tell how, through the deeds of supernatural beings, a reality came into existence, be it the whole of reality, the cosmos, or only a fragment of reality, an island, a species of plant, a particular kind of human behavior, an institution. Myth, then, is always an account of a creation. It relates how something was produced, began to be." End quote. That's why the myths of Mars are most often creation stories. They are tales which anticipate the first exploration or the first settlement of the New World. Citizens of nations participate in their national myths, as I alluded to before, through rites which recall to mind the founding of their nation and the critical events that established what is understood to be its enduring form. But the myths of Mars join their adherence to that which does not yet exist, even as the known topography of this new world is covered time and again in the flesh and substance of the grandiloquent schemes of countless dreamers. Language, history, artistic culture, religion, political forms, and countless other aspects of human civilization are related to the future myths of Mars, and mythological language, land, and imagined history are joined together in the mind. Such elements of civilization or culture bind people together in a way which they understand as defining them in a distinct way. Nations, tribes, religions, ideologies are understood in terms of their founding myth and the way in which those who are their adherents are bound to one another in community. As Thomas Molnar observed in his book entitled Twin Powers, Politics and the Sacred, as follows, and I quote, "We have seen that community does not regard itself as truly constituted until a sacred beginning is ascribed to it. Children become aware of their individuality and personhood only long after birth, when at the age of 3 or 4 they perceive themselves as distinct unities. A collectivity, on the other hand, a tribe or a nation, must know its identity at once. It seems that the fact of community requires a very precise coordination of sacred and profane. The two cooperate in order to give the emerging communal entity a graspable consciousness, a means of orientation in time and space, here in the concrete, but also simultaneously in the dimension of ontological reality in the cosmos. Every major act of the community will thereafter embrace the totality of the past with the help of commemorative events, ceremonies, symbols, gestures, and a rich register for the senses, including national anthems, flags, poems, legends, and myths, burial places, and battlefields. An invisible society of a moral, social character is placed above the tangible society, as it were, inseparable from it, explaining it to new generations and blocking it to aliens." End quote. Thus, the various schema for a Martian calendar, flag, and other such mythological aspects of culture are all indications of an attempt at anticipatory participation in a myth which pertains to a reality which does not yet exist. Thus, the adherents of the myth must resort to such religious language as fate or destiny to express the inevitability of the truth to which they have made such a profound commitment. In his essay entitled The Idea of Culture, philosopher Paul Skulason offers such insights regarding culture which are of great significance to our considerations regarding the myth of Mars. He made the observation that culture is born from an encounter with nature, and I quote, "We will never overcome our feeling of discovering nature as this totality, independent of our will, into which we are born, also independently of our own will, I presume. The feeling or natural emotion is, I believe, the only foundation of culture, if foundation there is." End quote. Culture, derived from the Latin word cultus, carries some sense of a root linked in both the soil and religious observance. A word that means tilled, protected, and worshipped, creates or expresses an interesting set of associations in the mind, which carry over into the understanding of culture. Again, in his words, and I quote, "Land, language, and history are the grounds for each and every culture. A living culture is a culture where people cherish their land, preserve their language, and transmit their memories to new generations. End quote. Now, that author's experiences as an Icelander, well aware of his own culture's linkage to these 3 points, certainly influences his analysis. But his analysis is worthy of careful consideration, in my opinion. None of these points is rooted in any inherent hostility toward other cultures. Rather, it expresses a self-awareness rooted in a received sense of shared community, both with those who are long dead and those who shall be born in ages to come. It is a community rooted in a place, and it is a people with a history. Thus, he elaborates on this last point as follows, to quote, "The last element required is history, or ways of remembering, in order to go on sharing the same way of behaving. As the land provides organization of space, history provides the organization of time, of persistence and unity throughout time. As we all know, history is the basic means of transmitting culture. Every known culture is a collection of stories for narrating to children, even before they can talk." Of the 3 primary types then of history, secular, sacred, and mythological, the last of these 3 modes most immediately addresses the sense of continuity within culture. It is often the first form of historical awareness inculcated in childhood, and it is a form which is invoked at death. Myth is always there, defining the individual in terms of his relationship to his community, to his culture. If there is a sense of meaning or purpose which transcends the individual, and which binds those who now live to those who have lived or who will live in the future, there is myth playing its role of transmitting culture across the generations and reifying the bonds which make a people. The myths of Mars are contending to shape such a people now, and the dream of a living Mars is bound up with these myths. Now, being somewhat of a fan of object lessons, I would simply... An item of myth in concreto. This one has intrigued me because, again, one of the points I made earlier on was that myth is expressed in terms of cultural markers like flags. Now, this is a fun one because this tricolor association is now so taken for granted in Mars Society circles, and yet its genesis is in precisely a fictional account, which we have then brought into the society as a symbol of what we're all about. And if, perchance, there is some future Mars civilization, is obviously the point of interest and contention for all of us and for many others, this is among many others that may contend for actually being a flag someday. Now, in that circumstance, we will have come amazingly full circle from something which is rooted in a work of fiction to a society dedicated to a reality, to a future society which adopts that in its place and may develop its own mythological history with regard to how that tricolor came to that new world, so that myth gives birth to myth and shapes those lives which are to come. I would gladly receive any questions at this time. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Yeah. Kim Stanley Robinson's 3 books, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, which, has anyone here actually gotten through blue? There are a few hands. But generally speaking, if you've hung around the Mars Society for a while, the red, green, blue is there in reference to that whole context of backstory. But we sort of take it for granted now. I mean, the Martian flag. And the question lays bare the fact that we don't always remember where that came from. Yes, sir. Well, yeah, that's the thing, is that mythologies can be positive or negative. And the unifying aspect of mythology in this is that it's perceived by the adherent of the myth to be true. And so therefore it can never be perceived by the person who believes as being a construct. And so all of them are of that kind of a cosmic significance. You believe that through this myth you are understanding something which is ordered into the nature of creation itself. And that whether you want to stress that in terms of other mythologies such as creation or evolution, you have an imposed axiomatic assumption with regard to the nature of the universe itself, which then expresses itself in these mythological constructs. But it's important to realize that these are not things which you're consciously saying, hey, we're going to build a myth that we'll all believe. They simply arise. And that one of the things that binds this room together is that sense of, oh, no, this is true, and this is the best future for mankind. And so you've always got that contention between, well, we believe it to be true, but can we bring it to pass? And that also drives myth. Am I out of time? All right. Thank you.